In this video, we're going to talk about custom CSS selectors. Why? Because they're really useful for troubleshooting when automating the browser. I'm Alex, co-founder of Axiom, a Chrome extension for automating the browser, which requires no code. Let's get started. This is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about what a CSS selector is. We're going to talk about the types of CSS selectors there are. We're going to, in particular, highlight the attribute selector as that's really useful. Then we'll go through some real-world examples in Axiom of where CSS selectors are useful for troubleshooting, in particular, scraping the web or trying to click on a button that doesn't seem to click. By the end of this video, you're going to be fully clued up. You're going to be able to use custom selectors to solve your problems. Okay. First of all, though, we're just going to quickly touch on Axiom for those people who are new to Axiom and have found this video on YouTube. We're just going to quickly run through what Axiom is. Axiom is a Chrome extension for automating the browser. On screen, you can see the website. You can install the extension from there. It requires no credit card. It's free to join, and you get 2 hours of runtime to build and test some bots to see if you can get any value out of the tool. And lastly, don't forget our customer support is there to help you build your bots. Just submit the form and we will get back to you. And if we can solve your problem, we're going to. Okay, so first up, what is a CSS selector? A CSS selector is part of a CSS rule. It's one of 2 elements. A CSS rule has, or is made up of 2 parts. A set of instructions that tell the rule what the style of something is going to be. For example, background blue, font size 12. And then the next part of that rule is a name. And that's what we call the selector. That's in fact the selector. The types of names can vary. If it's going to be a class selector, and we'll talk about different types of selectors in a moment, you'll probably give it a name like blue button, and then define a set of styles that make the button appear blue. That's a CSS selector. So there are 3 main types of CSS selectors that you should get yourself familiar with and are just quick to pick up and learn. There's element selectors. So think of the web or a web app as just made up of, on screen, of loads of different types of building blocks. Those building blocks could be a div, they could be a page title, which would be a H1, or it could be just blocks of text, which will be wrapped in P tags. And you can use those as straight up CSS selectors and apply style rules to them, or you can use them to just identify those elements on the page. So that's one type. Another useful type is the class selector, and that's what the example you see on screen here. A class could be called something, I'm just highlighting it with a mouse, could be something like box, and then you'd have a style in those brackets. The important thing to know about classes, they all have the dot in front of them. So that's what you need to make sure you use when declaring a class-based CSS selector. You've got to have the dot. Another example could be dot button, and that would apply styles to a HTML element that has the name or the class declared on it called button. I'm going to show you some examples in the HTML shortly. And then you've got IDs, which aren't so common anymore. If you do find one, they can be useful because they are often unique. An ID is a hashtag. You need the hash before the actual name of the selector to use them. And that takes us nicely onto the next type of CSS selector we're going to cover, and that's the attribute selector. This one I find really useful in browser automation. Ask me why, and I'll tell you this. It's because they are often unique to the element they're applied to. And one of the challenges in browser automation is that it's really hard sometimes to identify and find a unique element on the page because people don't want browser automation necessarily to happen on all sites, so they give everything the same class. And so how do you know it's unique? Well, attribute selectors are often unique because on certain HTML elements you have to give them these attributes, and you can use them to target with your scrapers or your clicks. more about that later, but attribute selectors, essentially you have to give them some sort of other type of selector you'll use, whether it's an element selector, which I've used here. An A is basically a link, and then they've used the attribute selector, which you always declare inside the square brackets, and then you give it the attribute, which in that case is title. I'll show you more about those attribute selectors shortly. But those sort of 4 types of selectors that you will find useful to learn about, and you can read more about them in the blog to build your custom selectors that you may use inside of Axiom. Okay, I'm just going to click sit. Okay, next up, I'm going to show you how to use Chrome's Web Inspector. Okay, let's open up Chrome's Web Inspector. It comes free with every version of Chrome, and you may have seen a developer using it and showing off their understanding of the web and doing things that look impossibly magic. Well, it's not that much magic and it's not impossible. We're just going to show you a subset of features you'll be able to pick up really quickly. So how do you open the Chrome Inspector? Well, you could go up to the tabs and you could go to View and down to Developer Tools, etc., and open in your computer, or you could just do this, right click and press Inspect, and up pops the Inspector tool. And the Inspector tool is essentially a way of looking at the code, the building blocks that make up a web page, and the CSS rules that apply to it. That's why it's a really useful tool for when you want to identify custom CSS selectors that you're going to want to use to troubleshoot the axioms or automations that you're going to be building with Axiom. Okay, so let's just run through, take a look at what's on the page. Let's see if we can find one of the element selectors that we talked about. And by clicking on the top left here of the arrow inside the box icon, I can then just inspect individual elements on the page by moving my cursor around and clicking on them. And let's look at this button. Now, you talked about element selectors, CSS selectors, and here's an example of one, an A, that is a link. So to use that selector, we could just type A. And there, up there, the H1 we discussed, you can see the element selector there, and you can see their divs wrapping all around them. Now, you'll also see the class selectors as well. Those are the selectors where you have a dot in front of the name. And like I said, ID selectors are quite rare these days. I don't think on this page we actually use any ID selectors. Okay, so I'm just going to also then dive over to LinkedIn for a second. I'm going to open up Chrome Inspector. The reason I'm doing this again is because I also wanted to show you an attribute selector on the page. So buttons or forms or any elements that have extra functionality other than looking pretty on a page often might have an attribute selector like we talked about. And here we can see the button has several. The next button. This is an example. And let's look for another example that's got type as well. That's another attribute. So we've got a couple of attribute selectors on there we could use. And that's how simple the inspector tool is to just look at pages, look at the code and extract selectors from. Just to summarize the layout, on the left you've got the big box here. This is all the HTML that's making up the web page or web app you're looking at, and there on the right, those are CSS rules if you've never seen one before. Most of you probably have, so just keep fast forwarding to the next section if you want to learn about CSS selectors and Axiom. Okay, so that's the inspector tool. Now that also leads me nicely on to using CSS selectors in combinations. I think we should just talk about that really quickly. And here you can see, let's pick, for example, if we wanted to select this button to make sure it's unique, we'd probably use 2 selectors. So we'd probably use button, and that's an element selector, and we'd combine it with this attribute selector to click the previous. So that would be button, and then we'd use square brackets and insert this attribute selector into that, and that would be a good combination of selectors. If you wanted to select the H2 element here, for example, you might use the selectors H2 and then a class selector and pick one of these classes that look unique, probably the pb2. So you'd add so the selector would be h2.pb2, and that would be how you could combine a selector to try and identify the h2 or apply a style to it or extract it with a web scraper. Let's just recap. We've learned what CSS selectors are. We've learned how to identify them with Chrome Inspector. We've learned about the attribute selector, and we've learned how to combine CSS selectors. Why have we been doing that? Well, because in Axiom you can automate certain tasks like scraping the web or clicking and interacting with the web interface on buttons or entering text into forms. And sometimes there may be an issue where our no-code tools haven't selected the right selector, and that you can simply add a custom selector to solve the issue that may arise. Now, I'm going to take you through some real-world examples in a second, but before we do that, I'm going to just open up Axiom and just show you some of the steps that can use custom CSS selectors, the scraping step, the click button, etc. So if you're new with Axiom and you've installed it, or you're going to install it, you can go to our website, axiom.ai. But once it's installed, you can just open and close it from the toolbar. And I'm already inside our no-code builder. This allows you to build automations or bots simply by combining steps, no code required. And here are 3 examples of steps that use custom selectors. This is our web scraping step. Now, 9 times out of 10, or even 9.9 times out of 10, all you're going to need is our selector tool, which is this beautiful no-code interface that just allows you to select elements off a page with a click. But just occasionally, you might find that selector doesn't work as well as you want it to, and you may want to try a custom selector to get that difficult to get to data when scraping. Now, it's simple to add a custom selector. It's not as simple as we like it. We're in fact updating this interface as you speak, and there's going to be a new interface for selecting the actual custom selectors yourself using Axiom. It's going to make everything far simpler. But if you want to use a custom selector, you can just click in here, set custom selector. This is our data object, and you can edit this. I will talk about that pattern later at the end of the video and how to edit the data object. But in the meantime, I'm just going to delete it. And now you can add your own custom selectors. So if I wanted to scrape a load of links off the page, I could just do A. And if, let's say, they had a class of button, a.button. If I wanted to do, sorry, misspelled it. If I wanted to do more than one custom class on that scraper tool, I could just add another CSS rule and separate, or selector rather, not a rule. I can just separate them with a comma and add multiple custom selectors. So that's one of the steps that you can use to get data. Also, clicking buttons. You can also add a custom selector. You might want to do that when the button is for some reason not being clicked and you don't understand why. You can try a custom selector again, just delete and click save when you've put in your new custom selector. And there's also other interact. This is an interact step that's got these sub-steps. There are also other sub-steps like enter text that you can use custom selectors with. Now, presuming you're watching this video to help sort of troubleshoot or learn about CSS selectors, you're probably familiar with these steps already. If not, like I said, Axiom is free to try. Well, it's free to drive, it's free to try as well. Just go to axiom.ai. Now, let's get on with some real-world examples. So example 1 could be that you're building a scraper and you're going to go through a list, extracting some details off LinkedIn, and you need to click on the pager. And the pager is the button that goes to the next page and the next, so you can get the results that are on the other pages. Anyway, for some reason, the next button isn't being clicked. How can you solve that? Well, the first way I would always recommend trying is, pardon me, let's first of all just set this bot up quickly to scrape some data off the page. If you bear with me, I'll just go back. I'm just going to get data. I'm just going to quickly select the data that I want off the page. I'm just going to loop through the names. I'm going to just move me up a little bit and add another column. This time I'm just going to get some links. There we go. Okay, so that's the data selected. I'm just going to move myself back down. And we've got that set up. And what do we need to do next? Obviously, we need to click the pager. So let's click on Find Pager. But let's press Complete. Now, let's do max results, say 50. Let's say I run the bot and for some reason it doesn't go to the next page. It's just not clicking the pager. First thing I would always recommend doing is just reselecting the pager. Move the cursor around and try and select it at a different point. You can see the orange box changes the div it's wrapping around. Now we want to do button, press Complete. Now if all else fails, let's use our custom selector skills. Now first of all, we're going to do a right click on Web Inspector, and this is where we're going to use the attribute selector. Why? Because on a next button, it won't be the same on all next buttons, but on this next button, we've got a unique attribute, this one, that uses the text next. So I'm going to take that attribute, and I'm also going to look at the HTML, and you can see that it says button there. So I'm going to use that element selector as well. I'm going to remember I talked about combinations. I'm going to use the button selector. Okay, so now to add that selector, I just need to formulate it. So I'm going to use two custom selectors together, an element and an attribute. I'm just going to open up Axiom again. I'm going to open up the pager custom selector. And I'm going to delete all the code that's in there. That's our tool trying to work out the selector. I'm just going to give it a really simple one because I know it's unique to the page. Now, interestingly enough, if you see how much code we have to generate to try and work out the selector, but if I do it manually, it's going to, I don't require nearly as much code. It's just button, close brackets, the attribute, the square brackets. That uses less code than our, or less classes than our no code selector tool. Why? Well, because the human brain is pretty damn sophisticated, as you are well aware of. And with my brain, or even your brains as well, you can just work out your own selectors really quickly. It just doesn't require as much code or the CSS selectors as the tool itself requires to do it, because your brain does all the crunching in between. It's pretty cool. Anyway, so that's one real world example of how you can use a custom selector. I'll just click Save to find a button to click it on a page. Another good example could be a listing website, a property one. For example, another good example is Zillow. Now, you've got all the listings on the right, and you probably want to scrape the links so you can build a bot that loops through the links, goes and scrapes the data off Zillow. Perfectly possible. But one of the issues I found when building a bot for this was that you've got lots of different data types, although they look the same. In here, there's sponsored content, and I didn't want the sponsored content. Also, the structures themselves change because they have varying data. Now, when I ran the bot the first time, I just didn't get the amount of, or I didn't get the results in the correct order that I expected. It was missing the odd property. Now, I tried using the selector tool a few times, and I would just found a part to click on, so I wanted the links, repeating link, and you can see, I'm just going to delete that. You can see here, I can just change them to links, and we get the links. Now when I ran the bot, I just didn't get the data back that I wanted, so I solved this using a custom selector. Now, I'm just going to delete that out of there in a second, but I'm just going to open up our friend, the inspector tool again. Inspect. and I'm going to look at the content. Now, this is a new concept I'm going to introduce as well as a grouping selector. So we're going to use two selectors, not in combination, but one as a grouping, because we want to get multiple elements. What I want to do, my thinking is that I want to get the links just inside this area because I don't want to scrape the ones over here and I don't want the links up here. So I'm going to look for a selector that is unique to this area of the page where the links are I want. So it's going to be some like box where they will sit in. I want a selector of that box. That's because by using that grouping selector, I can then like target the link inside of that, knowing I'm not going to scrape the rest of the page for links. Whereas if I just use just the A selector, for example, I'll get every link on the page. Now let me just open those inspector tools again. Whoops. And let me look for a grouping selector. And I'm going to basically look at one of the boxes. So I've got to the box and then I'm going to, it's called traverse the DOM is the technical word. And so that all LI elements are all a list inside a UL, an unordered list. Now I just need to find a name of a wrapping div. And look, here it is. It's even got an ID, search results. Now I'm not going to bother using the ID. I'm going to actually use this class. So that is my grouping div. I'm just going to cut and paste, open up Axiom and start adding that. So I've got the grouping div. Now I need to just add one more. So when I mentioned traversing the DOM, you can actually use selectors to traverse the DOM. So I'm going to use this first selector to select the box that my links are in. Then I'm going to add another selector, so it would go there, the selector would go there, then it's going to go to the links, and then just repeat it all to scrape them. Now back to my inspector tool. And now I'm going to look at the links and see what classes I've got here that makes them unique. Now that's just a simple list card link. Cool, so I can just use that. Just going to open up Axiom. Now I'm going to add the, because it's always worth using the A, the element selector, then a dot because it's a class selector. There we go. Now that selector should grab the links from the listing over there. And once again, to just quickly recap, I used a grouping selector here, which is a useful technique to basically herd your sheep or get all the links within a space. Thank you. Now, one final scenario that may require a custom selector to solve the problem is, let's say you're automating data entry into a form. Let's just look at Apollo login, where I've built many bots to log in and interact with Apollo. I'm going to inspect. I want to enter some text to log me in. I'm going to inspect because it's not being entered. I'm going to use my inspector tool skills and I'm going to look for some CSS rules or selectors that I can use rather to try and target that input. Now I can see that we've got the elements type selector here, input, and I can actually also use either name, password, this attribute selector. So this one's going to be rather simple. I'm going to open it up. I've got my enter text step set up, and I'm just going to, what did I say? There's an element selector, input, and now I can just add my square brackets, name, password, and that's my custom CSS selector I've set up that will enter the text into that form element. Awesome. It's been a long old journey on this video, and we've learned a lot. We've learned about CSS selectors, how we can use them in Axiom to help troubleshoot. Last of all, I mentioned we're just going to look at Axiom's its actual data model for when it generates the selectors via the no-code tool. So when we use the no-code, let me just add a scraper. When we use the no-code selector tool to generate our selections, let's say for example a looping selection here, And now I'm just going to scroll up. I'm just going to just repeat the same selection again, press complete. Well, once we've done our selection, Axiom generates a data model. That's basically, a data model is all of that data structured in a way that we can share it with the other steps to execute its function. And you can see here, this is the data model, and the more complicated the selectors, the more that data model will be filled in. You can edit this data model, but it's quite tricky. I recommend taking it into a text editor and what you want to do is edit. Basically, the selector is between here. Look for the text selector, and then in between these speech marks, and that's the selected there, and that's the part you want to edit and add your own selectors in. And then if you want to add more selectors, you're going to have to go between the brackets, and this is where it gets uber complicated. And you're going to want to basically take the whole selector. Say I wanted to add a third selector, I could press a comma after that closing bracket and add another selector in and add another one in, and I can just edit my selectors, etc. You can also change the result type here. So it's text content, so that means it's just scraping text, but if you wanted to use it to get custom link selectors, you would, let me just, basically you would use the type names you see in here. If I click save, so that'd be a link, I can just add the custom, and I can see you can just add the text link into result type to get, and that returns a link rather than text, and you can also put HTML in to get different result types. Now, just get in touch if you've got more questions about those. We'll probably do a separate piece on them, and I think there's some documentation on them I'll share in the actual blog article. The good news is, though, we have built a replacement to this custom selector tool that means you won't need to edit the data model. In another couple of releases, I think it may even just one release, it's built, it's being tested, it's just being styled. We're going to introduce custom selectors to our selector tool, where you can just click custom selector, and there's basically this new interface that allows you to click and then choose your own custom selectors without code. So that's pretty awesome. That's coming soon, so keep an eye out for it. I hope today's lesson has been useful. If you do get stuck though, use our customer support, axiom.ai/support. Reach out and we'll be there to help. Thank you.